The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back talking vintage sports in the zone. I'm Ralph Tycho of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Three of the four mavens of the times are with us. Al Blumkin is not. David Hubler, how are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you.
And Hal Bock.
Hi, everybody.
How you doing, Hal?
I'm good.
This is a special show because it's spring training, and I feel that we have the genuine article who can tell us about what spring training was like for a baseball family in the 30s. And George Case III, your dad, George Case Jr., was a terrific Major League Baseball player, later a manager and coach in the minors, a Major League coach. What they called in those days a baseball lifer. Does that expression ring true, George Case?
Yeah, well, it sure did. It's a very apt expression when it came to my dad because he was involved in baseball. His first minor league experience was 1936, and he retired in 1986. So it was really 60, almost 60 years because he was playing before that. But as far as professionally, it was about 50-some years as a major league player and a coach and all that. So. Yeah, I'd say my dad was a baseball lifer, absolutely.
Remind us who turned your dad from pitching to playing outfield.
Well, it was another baseball lifer, that's for sure. It was Connie Mack, and
Connie Mack.
My dad went to he went to a tryout with Connie Mack in 1936 at Chi Park, and Mr. Mack asked my dad to run. Hit a few because he went as a pitcher, and after he saw my dad hit and run, he called my father over and said, "Young man, your future in baseball is going to be as an outfielder, not a pitcher." So that was good advice, and my dad took it, and he was a major league outfielder the rest of his major league career.
Yeah, shades of Babe Ruth.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, David, you mentioned Babe Ruth. People, a lot of times they overlook the fact that he was such an outstanding pitcher. And,
right.
He was a sensational pitcher, just that he had that unique ability to hit home runs, and anybody who saw him pitch said, we got to get that guy in the lineup every day. And, so he did.
As a major league pitcher.
Yeah, he was a great pitcher, and he was just a natural ball player. I think he was, we've talked about it before, I think he was born to be a ball player. I've seen pictures of him, St. Mary's Industrial School, when he was put there, and here he is, he's got a glove on one hand and a glove on the other hand. He could do everything, and as a pitcher, he was just, a terrific major league pitcher. And then he was converted to, being an everyday hitter. And even with that, I think he retired as a major leaguer with an unblemished record. I think he was something like 9-0 after he became a regular, major league hitter.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
He started out as a left-handed catcher, which is a baseball anomaly when he was at that school.
You're right about that, Hal. That's the photograph I think I'm referring to it, where he's got the catcher's mitt or something on his other hand, and I know that is a rarity because anybody hardly ever even makes a left-handed catcher's mitt because it's such a an anomaly. Anybody who's going to be a ball player, if he's a catcher, he better be right-handed. Left-handed catchers just don't come along that way.
And what
Same
happened
thing with third baseman.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
What happened
Yeah, same
was
thing.
he started making fun of the pitchers because they were getting lit up. And Brother Matthias, who was he saved him at that school, and he said, "You think it's funny? Well, why don't you go out there and try and pitch?" So that's when Babe Ruth started pitching, and he was striking out everybody.
Yeah.
And that was the start of something very special.
Absolutely, Hal. I'm glad you mentioned that because really, my earliest recollection of Babe Ruth was obviously as a hitter, but going back before that, when he started there at St. Mary's and started to pitch, and then with the Red Sox, he was just a terrific pitcher, great left-handed pitcher, and the choice had to be made, and it was made that he was going to be in the lineup every day. Because if he hadn't, what was he going to do? He was going to pitch every fourth day, and they're going to miss his bat. So no, it was converting him into a full-time, major league outfielder.
He also had a bit of a temper. He started a game in 1917 against, as a matter of fact, Washington, and he's on the mound. And the first batter is a guy named Ray Morgan, and the umpire behind the plate is an umpire named Brick Owens. And Ruth throws the first pitch. Owens calls it ball one. And Ruth kind of stares at him, throws the next pitch, ball two. And Ruth shakes his head. No. Okay. Next pitch, ball three. Now Ruth is getting a little hot under the collar, and he stares in at the umpire. And the next pitch, ball four, take your base. And Ruth charges off the mound to confront Brick Owens. Now, this is not a good thing, as you know, but Ruth was really angry, and he was yelling at him, and he said, "I ought to pop you." And Brick Owens said, "Well, if you do, you're going to get thrown out of the game." And Ruth took a swing at Brick Owens, hit him in the ear, and, of course, was ejected from the game. Now, the Red Sox brought in a pitcher named Ernie Shaw. Morgan is on first base, tries to steal second, he's thrown out. Shaw then goes ahead and gets the next 26 batters in order. He retires 26 consecutive batters. It's a no-hitter. I mean, it's a no-hitter with an asterisk. It's not a perfect game, and it's a combined no-hitter, but that was Babe Ruth. He's in the book as a combined no-hitter.
Doesn't he hold the record, a World Series record? A pitching record?
Yes, he had a record. He had a record of consecutive scoreless innings in the World Series. It was, I'll tell you right away, it was 29 2/3 consecutive scoreless innings in the World Series of 1916 and 1918. And that record was broken by Whitey Ford. With the
really?
game.
I didn't know that. Yeah, I was thinking Drysdale or Koufax, but
no, Whitey Ford broke it. So
interesting.
He was a terrific
another
pitcher
left-hander.
He was a terrific hitter.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to? Is Ralph still with us?
I am.
No, Ralph.
So to speak.
He is good. Okay.
Okay.
So to speak. So
you're just listening to all this, Ralph. That's all.
Oh, I learned a lot about Babe Ruth's that combined no-hitter. That's very interesting, Hal.
Well, I'm doing a thing on Babe Ruth, a project, and I came across that story, and it was just too precious not to share.
Okay,
yeah,
I woke up
great.
this morning thinking, Hal, are you going to do a revised edition of Band after this scandal with the Astros settles down?
Well, I'm available if they wanted to do it, but I'm not going to propose it. They'll have to come to me because I'm at an advanced age where I'm not looking for work.
We're all that way, Hal. That's for sure.
I know.
That hit me at age 18. The same thing.
Right.
I was 18. I was like Maynard G. Krebs for a lot of years. Work. Rest in peace, Mr. Shulman.
Yeah, great Max.
Great Max Schulman, right? Dobie, The Adventures of Dobie Gillis, was that?
Yeah, he wrote. He wrote a column, and Hal would remember this.
Hal, I'm not that old.
No. But Max Schulman wrote a syndicated column for college newspapers, sponsored by I think one of the cigarette companies, and NYU Square Journal published this. And it was in there like every week or so. You remember that? I mean, it was a nice, funny column by Max Schulman.
I vaguely remember it, David. I don't remember it exactly, but I sort of remember having a syndicated column in the paper,
Yeah, that was Max Schulman.
Do you guys have any of your NYU bylines or any of the newspapers from those days?
Sure, I have a whole year, my senior year.
I have 2 years, yeah. All bound.
Yeah, bound, absolutely.
Right. By Jay, this is a quick story. We used to use a printer out in Brooklyn, and it was in the old days, you didn't have...
Printers.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And they were two nice guys. They printed all sorts of different newspapers. They even printed Elijah Speaks, I remember, and they had all these different papers.
I remember that one. Yes,
and
Muhammad Speaks. It was Muhammad
Speaks. Right. And we used to have to go out there to check the galleys, make sure that it was all right, it was all done correctly. And it was a hike because you had to go down into the subway and you had to go across the Williamsburg Bridge or something, and out to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. But the best part of it was that the guys who owned this, the two guys who owned this press, they would always treat us to this wonderful delicatessen. A real
Saturdays,
Jewish
right?
kosher delicatessen. What?
Saturdays.
Whichever day you had to go out there. Yeah. That made the trip out there on the subway, and you had to be at it was hot in there. It was all hot type and linotype machines and stuff, and it was not in a great neighborhood, but the place was, a working print shop, so it wasn't like a hotel lobby. But the delicatessen was great.
Okay, would you guys, in no particular order, speak about spring training from the standpoint of you, David, being a fan, what it means spring training meant to you as a fan, and as a working press, working reporter, what did spring training mean to you, Hal Bock? And George, continue to talk about what spring training was like for the entire Case family, how you guys prepared, and have a great show. Take it away, George.
Okay, Ralph, thank you. I'm glad we're going to talk about spring training. Before I get into a few stories, but David, I wanted to ask you, and then Hal, you can follow up. But as a fan, did you ever go to spring training? Did you ever go to Florida and take in what's going on? Because spring training was always a big deal, but it gave a chance for fans to really get close to the players. And I'm just curious as to your experience, if you ever did that in your before your writing career, if you were that much of a baseball fan that you would actually go into Florida for spring training.
Well, I only went once, and it was fairly recent by spring training standards. We were down there visiting my son in the Orlando area, and the Braves had until this year had their spring training camp in Disney World I forget the part of Disney World, Downtown Disney or one of those things. So we got tickets and went, and it was really nice. Except, it wasn't what I imagined it to be as it was years ago, where people just sort of sauntered in and watched the game. And then maybe there was a small admission charge. I don't know, but it reminded me of what Tinker Field looked like, where
Right.
Washington had spring training camp. There were no frills, but when you go to Disney, everything is a frill, you know. So it was a little disheartening. You couldn't really walk around and talk to the ball players before the game because you had to just sit in the stands.
And David, that's one of the things I was curious about because when you mentioned, for instance, Tinker Field and how you jump in here, but when you mentioned Tinker Field, it was very rustic, and
Yep.
fans back then would go to spring training and they would be sitting in hard bleachers and all that kind of stuff, and you know the players would be right there and you'd be almost right next to them. Well, spring training, you know, today is totally different because you got some huge ballparks. And they do charge admission and all that other kind of stuff, where in the older days, you know, the ball players were just excited to be on the field, and they were very accessible to the fans. And it was like watching, you know, baseball when it first began, where you've got bleachers and you've got people in the stands, and the ball players are talking to the fans, and it's a totally different world than what it is today. Now, Hal, I'm interested in your situation, being a writer. Did you go and cover, whether it be the, you know, Yankees or the Mets or whoever it was, or the Giants, you know, for spring training? Did you actually go to Florida and see a lot of spring training games as a writer?
The easiest assignment in the history of journalism. Yes, the short answer to your question is yes, I went to spring training many times.
Right.
And you would go to the ballpark, and they'd have a workout maybe at 10 a.m., and the players were very accessible, very relaxed and very accessible. The dressing room was open, the clubhouse was open, and you could catch the players whenever you wanted. They were always around before workouts and after workouts. And by noon, the workout was done. You had a notebook full of material. You went back to the hotel and wrote some stories. Well, what could be easier than that? It was just a pleasure. Spring training was the best time of the year because the players are very easy going at that point. They've had the winter off, and they've got to get ready for the season, but they don't have to do it in one day. And so they're very relaxed and very accessible, pleasant to deal with. Not so much during the regular season. Often you ran into the same player, and he would brush you off. But during spring training, it was a dream. And I didn't play golf, but a lot of the writers would play golf in the afternoon after working at the ballpark in the morning. So, I mean, what kind of this is work, you know? This is like a vacation. And
you also you missed a lot of the last of the winter in the north.
Yeah, that's another thing. I love the spring training assignments.
Hal, I got a question for you because I'm not sure I know. Would you be considered a beat writer at that time, where you would follow a certain team, or did you just go around from camp to camp?
No, I bounced around from camp to camp.
Right. Okay.
What I often did would be, like, for example, I would set up in Clearwater where the Phillies train, and you could drive from there to Dunedin in like 10 minutes. That's where the Blue Jays were training. And then you went in the other direction, and Pittsburgh was training over in, I forget the name of the town, but
I think Bradenton is.
That's right. All the towns were pretty clustered, and so you could jump from one to the other. West Palm Beach was there, and you just jumped around. But there were beat writers obviously stay with their team, but I did not. I moved around a lot.
I have a question.
Would you write an I'm curious, Hal. Would you write an article, like you say you went back to the room or whatever? Did you have like notes for spring training that you had to publish, or write like every day or every week, or how did that work?
Well, I had to write every day. I'm being paid, I'm on assignment. Right. So whatever I came up with, I could come up with my own ideas and my own stories. And I wrote every day for sure. Often wrote more than one story a day. Right.
Now, would they be written as with your job as Associated Press? I mean, would go into the local papers, or would that go into Syndicate?
It would go on the wire.
How did that
work? Become available. It would move on the wire and would become available to 1,500 newspapers across the country. And the paper could choose to use it or not. It's up to them.
Right. Right. Okay. Good. Well, no, that answers my questions. I was just curious because I'm looking at it from a little different point of view than from yours as a writer. So I really, very interested in what you had to say there.
One time, I was based in Miami at one point, and this was when Fernando Valenzuela was the toast of the town in Los Angeles, and he was holding out, I guess, and he was going to report to camp late. And they told me, he's coming to camp today. You got to get up there. And I had to drive from Miami to Vero Beach, and that's not around the corner if you look at the geography of Florida. So I drove from Miami to Vero Beach. I got to Vero Beach and found the room where Fernando was going to be. And he arrived, and we had about 4 or 5 writers outside the room, and he was talking in Spanish. Well, one writer spoke Spanish, and he translated for us, and what he translated was not usable in a family newspaper. So it was a wild goose chase.
Now, when they broke camp, did you ever follow the teams on their way north, or did you just get back to New York?
No,
okay.
I went home. I would go to Florida for maybe a week. Sometimes. I don't think I ever did 2 weeks. I think I did a week. And I would jump around from camp to camp, get a couple of stories here, a couple of stories there, and then I would go home and wait for them back here in New York, wait for them to come north.
I have a couple of questions for you, George.
Yeah, go ahead, David. Go ahead.
Because this is something I've been interested in to find out. A lot of the ball players come down there early. They come down there with their families. I mean, I know they make a fortune today, so it's not a question of the money. But I'm just wondering, how is that, like say a rookie or a AAA ball player is invited, who pays the tabs for these guys while they're here they're in spring training trying to make the team, and they're not making that great salary?
Well, they get a per diem.
Even in the minor, yeah.
I think so. I believe they do.
Even in spring training.
Yeah.
I mean, what did they do? Yeah, but I mean, what did they do in your dad's day, George?
Well, yeah, they had a per diem, and of course, I'm not sure what it was because I was only a little kid at the time. But when you're talking about spring training, that was the thing about being the son or being in a baseball family. I mean, I used to love knowing that I was going to get on a train with my mom and dad, to give you an example, and you had a sleeper car because it was a 2 or 3 night trip down to Orlando from Trenton, New Jersey. So,
wow.
That's what it was. And then I know one year my dad drove, and that was like a nightmare because the car overheated and all that kind of stuff. But, the thing about it, I always remembered as a little kid being so excited because I was going to be in a sleeper car, and I was going to be in the upper berth or whatever it was, and you hear the click-clack of the rails and all that, knowing that, you're going to get down to Florida. And, sort of what Hal and what David, part of the joy of spring training was that it was relaxed. It did give the players a chance to unwind and, get ready for the season ahead, but it was very restful. And the fact is that they had time off to do things. I mean, my dad, I've got films of them. Clark Griffith put a golf tournament on, and he did this for years and years for all the players on their day off. Another time they'd go out fishing. And, what Hal's talking about playing golf, I mean, that was, I would say the vast majority of players, they just look forward to going out there and playing. And some of them would actually play with the writers. So, the writers might get an interesting story, away from the ballpark, just riding in a golf cart, talking to a player. And it's a little different world than today where you've got, the agents and everybody else involved. But that was a much more restful and relaxing time for baseball players and their families. I can remember going to Cypress Gardens. I remember, going as a little kid and watching alligator wrestling at a snake farm. and riding on donkeys and stuff with my dad, all that kind of thing. That's what went on with baseball families back then in spring training. It was a great time.
And they didn't mind the families showing up? I mean, it wasn't like a distraction?
No. I mean, it might be, David, I don't know. Maybe they had some arrangements. I have no idea. But I know, my mom and dad, they would have an apartment or whatever it is. Maybe the ball club, picked up their per diem as far as their meals and stuff. But then, when they went back to Washington for, the regular season, then my mother and father always rented a house for the season. But I'm not sure what arrangements they had as a youngster, because I said I was only 5-6 years old. I would have had no interest or knowledge of that. But I always know that I'd be in the stands with my mother, and I'd be watching my daddy out there on the field.
Yeah. They had a hotel in Orlando that they stayed at, and I can't think of the name of it now. I think I had it listed in the book. But that's what's always been. One of the neat things about it, of course, is that all of this was done during the day. I mean, they didn't play any night games in spring training. No. Now they do. And I remember I used to go to Yankee Stadium for opening day as often as I could. And the one thing that always impressed me was these guys, they all had a suntan, especially on the back of their necks. Now, I mean, I think that's where the term redneck came from. Because that's the one thing I remember distinctly. All the Yankee ball players would have this red neck, I guess, from being in the sun down there.
Right.
You were talking about the families. Families always, in my experience, always took condos, and they put the minor leaguers in a hotel, and they put two in a room, like roommates, and they would be in a hotel often with the writers, because writers didn't bring their families. Occasionally writers brought their families, the regular writers, but somebody like me who was moving around, I never brought my family down. But the minor leaguers would stay in the hotel, often with where the writers were staying.
Yeah, Hal, you bring up a memory for me. I know that, and I didn't even know it at the time. I wasn't even born. But somebody sent me an article that my dad's first year at spring training, he'd come up in 37, first year in 38. A couple of the other Washington so-called rookies, they were staying with some woman in her home, and she would cook the meals for them, and it was like a boarding house, and that's what they did. True. Yeah. It's very interesting, because I think later on, probably, my dad was an established, starter, so maybe they made special arrangements, and maybe the families were included in a condo or whatever it is. But, to change the subject a little bit, but it's still about spring training. I can remember when my dad became the third base coach for Mickey Vernon, the expansion Senators. And right after he was named to be third base coach, I remember being home, and I said, Pop, where are you going to have spring training? And he said, we're going to have it at Pompano Beach. I said, Pompano Beach? I said, I've never even heard of it. And that's what they did. They put up the players, I think, in some kind of motel with a swimming pool that was adjacent to the Pompano Beach Municipal Stadium or something like that. That's how low key it was, and it was almost like a high school baseball field where they were playing.
I have warm memories of sitting by a swimming pool with my little typewriter and typing a story, and I'm thinking to myself, "This is my job? Wow!
Yeah, right.
I have landed in a pot of jam here."
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, that's great. Absolutely great. Oh. I have a couple quotes, and I want to see if you guys remember. There was Rogers Hornsby had a great quote. I think it was from 1932 or something, and somebody asked him about what he does in the wintertime, in the off season. He said, well, I look out the window and I see the snow or whatever it is, and I think about spring. And that's what a lot of the players look forward to. I remember my dad all the time, and he loved to duck hunt and do all kinds of stuff. But he got real antsy when it came to middle of February because he couldn't wait to get down to spring training.
They It's a special time in baseball. There's no question about that. It's a low key, no pressure time, and it's a fun time for all concerned. Believe me, the writers and the players. We have a good time down there.
Now when
talk about
Hal and David, when my dad was playing, sometimes, and I have some letters, if the player was not happy with the contract that was being offered to him by the owner, almost all the situations with the owner, he'd hold out and say, I'm not going to spring training. Well, it usually meant that they would get together, and I've told this story before. My dad was a holdout one year for $500. And Clark Griffith said to him at the right before spring training, said, George, I need you down here at camp. He said, I'm going to give you the $500 you want, but if we don't make it up at the gate at the end of the season, I want the money back. That's a true story.
Yeah,
$500.
I put that in the book. I love that story.
Yeah, right.
Especially
I had mentioned, David, I had mentioned that to you because it is a true story. I mean,
Yeah, and it's especially poignant today. I mean, when these guys $500, that's like taking a pitch. They're going to come up to bat, take one pitch. That's $500 in their pocket. I mean,
It was. I mean, today when you have multi-million-dollar and mega contracts and agents and stuff, but that's the reality of it was back then. The players and the owners had the relationship, and that's where they negotiated. And the player, and we've talked about this before. I mean, this was before the with the reserve clause and all that. You were bound to that team. But there was still negotiation going on because the players wanted to play. I mean, it's not a question that they weren't going to play, because if they didn't sign the contract, they were out of a job unless they got traded. So, but it really came down to a matter of almost nickels and dimes on these kind of things. And by and large, the owners wanted the players, the starters, they wanted them there, and they would sign. They might meet halfway. Maybe my dad wanted $1,000 and he and Clark Griffith settled on $500. I mean, I don't know, but I just know that the circumstances was that Mr. Griffith told my dad in a letter, which I have, George, if we don't make it up at the gate, I want my money back.
Well, the owners for the longest time had the upper hand in negotiations with the players.
Right.
And there's a famous story, the origins of the Black Sox scandal in 1919. The Black Sox had a pitcher, White Sox had a pitcher named Eddie C. Cott, knuckleball pitcher, and he had a contract with Comiskey where he would get a bonus of $10,000 if he won 30 games. And he got to 29 games, and Comiskey ordered the manager, Kid Gleason, not to pitch him. Because if he doesn't pitch, he can't win that 30th game. And that made him so angry, made Seacott so angry, that he was easy pickings for the gamblers, and that was the beginnings of the Black Sox scandal.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing how that kind of stuff went on. But, I just know from my dad's experience that he and Clark Griffith and David, from doing your research, but the players appreciated Mr. Griffith because he was, he was an owner, but he was involved day to day, had been a player himself. And, the players negotiated with him directly. And they knew that baseball was his sole source of income. I mean, he didn't have deep pockets like some of the owners where they could go and pay whatever the market would bear. But with Mr. Griffith, he had to pay the players, and if they didn't make it up at the gate, they were going to have some financial, misfortunes down the road. And that brings up the story, which is true, about that 45 season where they finished, Washington finished a week early because Mr. Griffith had already signed a lease agreement with the Washington Redskins. They were a tenant, and he needed that money from the rental of Griffith Stadium, and the ball club had to, pay the consequence, which was finishing the season a week ahead of time.
With lots of double headers.
Yes. I think I looked at research, David. It was like 7 double headers in the last 2 weeks of the season.
Oh, yeah.
And
I mean,
just
they just tired these poor guys out.
Everybody out, right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the
exactly.
players.
Yeah, and they were I think they finished just about a game out. I mean, it was came down right to the last game of the season.
Yeah, they did.
And,
that last game of the season, I think I've told you guys, they're Washington sitting around the clubhouse listening to their game on the radio, and Hank Greenberg comes up in the 9th inning, hits a grand slam home run to clinch the pennant for the Tigers. And, Washington, if the Tigers had lost, then Washington was ready to get on a train and go into Detroit for a 1-game playoff. So that was the closest that they got. But at the start of the 45 season, I can tell you that nobody anticipated that. If they were at spring training the year before, that same team with those players finished in dead last, 8th place in the American League.
That's right. And when Greenberg hit that home run, interestingly enough, they were playing the Browns. And perhaps, I think, one of the dumbest managerial decisions ever. The manager ordered his pitcher to walk the batter. It was like first and second or second and third, and he ordered his pitcher to intentionally walk the batter to load the bases. Right. And so that Hank Greenberg came up, who had hit 59 home runs one year. And he had just come back from the Army early in the season, but he was in pretty good shape because he was hitting the ball quite well by the time he got to that game. And he just blasted the ball out of the ballpark. I was incredulous the first time I read that. I said, how can you possibly walk a guy to pitch that?
Yeah, David, I think the players were probably as incredulous when they're listening to it on the radio and say, what the hell is going on?
Yes, I'll bet. You're right. That's a good point, George. I never thought of that, but you're right. And it must have been so disheartening.
It was. It was. They were crushed. I mean, with my dad, I remember him telling me, years later, he said that was something that was very hard for them to get over, because that was the closest that they had ever come to the World Series. So, you're talking about 1945 until, 2019 with the Nationals. I mean, that's a long time between being in the World Series.
Yep.
I have another thing I wanted to ask you guys. The DVD that I have with films that my dad took of spring training. Hal or David, have you ever seen any of the films or any footage of baseball spring training back in those days? I mean, we're talking about
other than your dad's films. No, I haven't.
No. I mean, the reason I mentioned it because it was so rustic. It almost looks like you're at summer camp. And,
yes, good point. Yep.
I've seen photographs where the players, and this was the Yankees of all teams, sitting around in the clubhouse with a pot-bellied stove, and that was how they kept warm. And then during the spring training during the war years, Washington was lucky because they were considered a southern city, and they could be over in University of Maryland to train. But some of the Major League ball clubs, there wasn't such a thing as going to spring training in Florida. They had to have spring training in New York, up in Bear Mountain State Park, and some places with snow on the ground, and ski instructors and throwing snowballs rather than baseballs.
Yeah, I think the Cubs or the White Sox actually trained out in some farm area in, I think it was Indiana, if I'm not mistaken, or Illinois, and there was snow on the ground the whole time.
Right. Now that's where people were saying about, because that was World War II travel restrictions, and that was part of the deal with that was made that the players, the teams would have to train near home. So for Washington, it was pretty good because the University of Maryland, they could be inside if they had to, but some of the teams, they had to, go out in the snow and the cold and that kind of stuff. So, back then, spring training didn't mean Florida or didn't mean Arizona.
Right.
It meant wherever they could get a ball field that was close to home, that's where they were going to be.
Well, Washington had another advantage, too, because they were surrounded by Army forts at all Army camps,
right.
that had baseball teams. So there was competition. It may not have been major league quality competition, but they did have the opportunity to go from one camp to another and play these teams, or have the teams come into the field at the University of Maryland and play them. So they did get competition. And
right.
even just before the season started, and Griffith loved this, the players did too, they took a boat down the Chesapeake Bay to not to Richmond, actually further down to Virginia Beach area to play the naval teams down there. And so they had more opportunity for spring training games than a lot of clubs did, especially clubs that were like one team in the city. So,
right.
Yeah, they were really good. But before we end, I wanted to ask you something, because talking about spring training, this is some. If you remember, we had Luke Erickson on a number of months back, who's the maven of minor league baseball. And I was talking to him today at work, and I said, what bothers me so much about watching spring training games is that unless it's your home team and it's the home team announcing crew, you don't know what's going on, because the announcers, if it's not your home team, all these guys do is talk about their players. And so they ignore the competition. They ignore the names. You don't know who's playing. And Luke said, he said, I know a lot of these guys by reputation, and a lot of them are really good ball players. They're trying to make it, and you don't hear a word about them. It's number 92. So I wonder what you thought of that. If it bothers you, like watching the Mets or from playing away in Florida.
One other thing similar to what you're talking about, David, but one year my dad, this was after he got back from Hawaii, and then he was over in Japan and all that kind of stuff, which is another thing I wanted to mention about the difference between spring training here and spring training in Japan. My dad said that the players in Japan, when he was over there, they would work out for 8 to 9 hours a day.
Wow.
And he said American players would never put up with that stuff. You go out there and you're going to spend maybe 2-3 hours on the field, but in Japan it was part of their routine. They'd start at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they'd finish at 6 at night on the field the whole time. So he said that was a really eye-opening thing for him, and the Japanese, they called my dad the trick man because he came up and showed them some, Major League Baseball strategy and how to play the game the way we play it here. And he said they never did it before. They didn't know about backing up throws, and they didn't know. This was, 50 years ago, so it's a lot different world today because you got so many Japanese players. But the next season, the Japanese were so impressed with the knowledge that they got from my dad as the trick man, they sent a half a dozen of their players over to Washington spring training so they could work out with the big club. And that was during the spring. Mm-hmm. And they were, obviously so impressed. But on the other hand, they couldn't believe how casual. And, here's a Major League Ball club. They're only on the field a couple hours a day. And the Japanese had been on there for 9 hours a day.
Wow. That's like Ichiro. Ichiro's whole career was based on constant practice,
Right.
I mean, I read a big article about him in, I think, ESPN magazine, and the guy just had the same routine, whether they were playing, whether they were not playing, whether it was winter. I mean,
right.
Did the same thing day in and day out. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that probably came, David, from what we're talking about, the discipline
that
they
had.
Sure. They were used to that kind of, regime where here I mean, it's a lot different world, and it's more relaxed. And now, especially now, I mean, I'm sure the agents are telling the players, "Hey, ease up. Don't do a lot now because we don't want you getting hurt. You got a guaranteed multi-million-dollar contract."
Right, of course.
But back when my dad was playing and the other players, I mean, they were fighting for jobs, and if you went down, you had to hope that if you were only going to be on the DL or whatever it was for a couple games, because you didn't want somebody to take your spot. And back then they had so many farm clubs, and even I think it was how maybe you covered them when the Dodgers, they had Dodger Town at Vero Beach.
That's right.
They would bring all the organization players together in one location, and they put them through the same drills and talking about the same language and all that kind of stuff that they used.
That was a beautiful facility. That may have been the nicest spring training facility I ever visited. Just vast and so well organized, and just a beautiful place.
Yeah.
That was one place that I enjoyed going to. I'll tell you.
Now, how do you
there wasn't much else around there in those days, was there?
Was that branch Ricky's doing? Where'd that begin? The whole concept of Dodger Town.
Ricky did a lot of great things in baseball, and I think that was one of them. Yeah, he created that town essentially, Dodger Town.
Right. Yep. Right.
Yeah, well, and there weren't the attractions or the available distractions, might be a better word, available other than to play golf somewhere. Vero Beach and some of these places were just pretty much, just desolate areas where they could get cheap land and build these places. I mean, when they built in downtown Disney for the Braves, I mean, it's just like going to a major league ballpark, except on a smaller scale.
Oh yeah, they are, David, and that's what I mentioned too. Because like Orlando, when talking about Tinker Field, Tinker Field was a tiny little ballpark that was adjacent to a high school and college football stadium that later became the Gator Bowl. And I've got pictures of them, my dad and a couple of players in a sliding pit, and you can see the high school grandstand in the background. And that's the way it was. That's how informal.
Was that the Gator Bowl or the Citrus Bowl?
Well, I think, David, whether it was a Gator Bowl or Citrus Bowl,
but I know what you're talking about. There was a because I told you, I was there. I managed to visit the place before they tore it down.
Right.
But I know. In fact, they had high school teams playing there the last couple of years before it was. Yeah. And somebody told me that they actually took stands from Griffith Stadium to refit them into Tinker Field after the old original stands had just gotten too into bad shape.
Well, the one thing that bothered me, and we'll end it here, but the one thing that bothered me was Tinker Field. There's so much history, just like with Yankee Stadium. I mean, that it just blows my mind that they demolished the Yankee Stadium. But Tinker Field, they pretty much demolished Tinker Field, and there was a nice statue there of Clark Griffith, and whatever happened to that, I have no idea. But
I know players, that it was stolen. The plaque was stolen.
Okay, right.
That was
and it's just a part
plaque.
of history. I mean, this is part of our nation's history when it comes to baseball. And for me, when you look at the great stadiums of the past, and you only have two that are left right now, and that's Fenway and Wrigley. I mean, everything else is gone. And,
I know.
And it bothers me because it's just like I don't want to get on my soapbox, but as a society, we're like a throwaway society. If it's more than 100 years old, just knock it down and build something new. And yet we're in a world where the Roman Colosseum was built 2,000 years ago and it's still standing. And places in London are still, being used 1,000 years after they were built. Well, here we are with Yankee Stadium, and what Hal has followed, and David and all with the Yankees. But there in 1923, the house that Ruth built, and today it's now the house that George built, still called Yankee Stadium, but a far cry from what it was when it was the original Yankee Stadium.
Yeah.
Well, it's like a museum now.
Right. Yeah. It looks like. Yeah. But look. I was at what was it? Turner Field. I was at Turner Field in Atlanta the first season that the Braves played there after coming out of what was it? I forget the previous statement. But anyway, that's gone already, and there's a new stadium. 1999. It was
right.
Opened. I think it was 1999. It opened. Or 1998, just around there, and boom! Within 20 some odd years, it was gone. Same thing with the Mets, the original Mets Stadium.
Right.
I was in the outfield there when they were building it because I was at some sort of World's Fair, covering some sort of World's Fair thing with the mayor, and you could see them building the stands around the field. It didn't take long for that to be demolished too.
Right.
So none of these stadiums. Same thing in pro football. The old Giants Stadium in New Jersey. That's gone already.
Right. And they're all coming up with different names. I mean, I don't even know half the names of the new stadiums anymore because they, whoever gets the signing rights, they'll have it for a couple of years and then they'll change it to something else. So
that's right.
But
and they do that on a regular basis.
Right.
Verizon Center here in D.C., where the Washington plays, where the Bullets play and the Caps play, is now some bank. I forget which bank it is.
Yeah.
But they've changed
right.
it. Yeah. It's awful.
Well, to get back, to get back to the Washington thing. I mean, at least when Griffith Stadium, to give you an example, was torn down and Howard University Hospital was built on its original site, at least they preserved a lot of the photographs and they preserved something. You could walk in the lobby of Howard University Hospital, and I did myself to see it, and there's home plate on the floor showing where the original home plate was when it was Griffith Stadium. So at least they preserved a little bit of the history of it. But Hal, with your situation, I mean, it really drove me crazy when I heard that Yankee Stadium was being demolished, because I thought to myself, you're going to get rid of all the history that happened at Yankee Stadium for what? To put up this new art of, where Ty Cobb, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, DiMaggio, Mantle, Barrett, they never played at this Yankee Stadium. They never did.
No.
It didn't even exist.
Right.
The original home plate. The original home plate is still there, adjacent to the new stadium, and the infield is there. And there are high school games play on, and some of the outfield, of course, where high school and PAL or whatever American Legion teams play there, and that is the original home plate and in the proper location. But that's all.
Well, I'm glad they at least saved that, but to me, it just, when you see the structure and people say, "Well, I'm going to a ball game at Yankee Stadium," I said, "Well, enjoy yourself," because it's not the same field as it used to be. I can tell you that.
No, not at all. I mean, I've only been there once.
Right.
The view is different. That we could see the subway train going by into the tunnel, and the Bronx County Courthouse is no longer there. Well, it's there, but it's not in view. So
yeah. Well, you know what? I was only there once, and my memory, and Hal and David, my memory of going to a ballpark. You had ballpark food. You had a hot dog. You had popcorn. You had peanuts, Cracker Jack. Coke or beer if you're older. Today, I go to Yankee Stadium, and I'm sitting there, and the guy I'm with, half the game he's not even there. He's back in the gourmet restaurant eating lobster tails.
Yeah, right. That's right.
That's right.
It's a different experience, believe me.
There were several restaurants in the new Yankee Stadium. Like my cousin says, it's a food court with a baseball field around it.
Yeah, that's right.
That's about it. Well, hey guys, our time, but I thank Hal. Thank you for your memories of spring training, David, and I hope that I was able to jog your memories a little bit. I know me, it's fun for me to talk about it because I had some personal experiences, and spring training was always a big thing in our family, and I can only tell you that I know. My dad used to get real antsy come the 1st of February. He said, I got to get ready. Got to get ready to go south because he couldn't wait to get back and start to throw the ball around again. So
sure.
It's been fun for me, guys, and I appreciate it, and we'll talk to you next week.
Next week. Okay. Take care, guys.
Good night, everybody.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Good night, Hal. Night, David.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.